Welcome back to this Fox News special, Saddam Hussein on trial. I'm Dan Senor. Even after Saddam Hussein was pulled from his spider hole and thrown in prison, investigating his crimes is a dangerous calling. Terrorists are stopping at nothing to derail the trial, including murder. Jafar Abdul-Jabbar is the lead prosecutor at the Iraqi Special Tribunal. He is appearing on camera, shedding his anonymity and the measure of personal security that goes with it for the first time.
My brother, who was also my personal driver, was killed 6 months ago.
Terrorists reach your family, and yet you're still coming on camera.
After I was told about this, I went home, had a talk with myself, and reached a conclusion. I have to do this for the sake of justice, for the sake of a fair trial.
Chief Investigative Judge Rod Juhi already knows what it's like to have the eyes of the nation on him. Last July, many Americans were transfixed by these pictures of Saddam Hussein, a dictator who for 30 years survived assassination attempts, uprisings, and the Gulf War, being hauled into court. A bigger shock to many Iraqis was that Judge Juhi allowed himself to be seen on camera. For Iraqis knew that by appearing on television, Juhi put a bullseye on his forehead, and also on his family, friends, and colleagues.
We want to show the world Iraq does have a solid legal system, and it's independent.
As you will see, the Iraqi system also differs from the U.S. legal system in many respects. For starters, in Iraq, judges like Juhi, working with prosecutors like Abdul-Jabbar, investigate the crimes and build the cases, then turn their work over to other judges who try the case. Juhi lives and works under constant guard in Baghdad's protected green zone. We met up with him there in his new offices, still under construction. Why do you keep putting yourself in these difficult situations?
It is not the issue whether I continue to work on a difficult or dangerous trial. This is my duty. We want to show the rule of law, is not the rule of revenge.
Juhi and Abdul-Jabbar have spent almost 2 years preparing the first cases set to go before the tribunal. They've called through 30 years of government documents, some recovered from Saddam's own intelligence office. Mass graves have been exhumed and witnesses located and interviewed, all while terrorist assassins and bombers do what they can to drive the country into chaos. How many witnesses have you interviewed since you began this process?
Some days I see 8 to 9 witnesses, and that is more than an hour per person. And it's not just witnesses. I've gone through thousands of documents.
This trial will expose many crimes that the people of Iraq never knew about.
Are you saying there are new crimes, new atrocities?
Oh yes, there are many other cases.
Investigators say Saddam could be tried for over 300 crimes. But for now at least, they focused on about a dozen. They include crimes of aggression, like the invasion of Kuwait, which resulted in the 1991 Gulf War, and subsequent violent suppression of mass uprisings in the north and the south. Crimes against humanity, like the destruction of the southern marshlands and the forced deportation of thousands of Faili Kurds to Iran. But the biggest and most notorious is the genocidal chemical weapons attack on the Iraqi Kurds in 1988. Over 5,000 people were killed and thousands more were injured, making it the largest chemical weapons attack ever against a civilian population. Aras Abid Akram survived the attack but lost all 12 members of his immediate family. Under heavy security, Fox News traveled to Halabja to hear his story. He showed us all he's got left to remember them by. This house and a few faded photos. He told us how for 8 hours a mixture of conventional weapons and chemical agents rained down on Halabja.
4 bombs exploded in this small area. That's one of them, and there is one in this corner, and in the back there is one, and there is another one.
Aras took us to where he ran for cover when the bombing started, in a neighbor's basement. That day, nearly 100 people were crammed into this small space.
Three sounds mixed in here. Sound of babies crying, sound of injured people, and the sound of explosions.
Only Aras and 7 others emerged from the basement alive. He staggered out after 3 days underground, just in time to see his family's bodies being lifted out of a neighboring basement.
These are my memories, and every time I think about it, I get angry at the person who committed this crime.
Halabja, just 10 miles from the Iranian border, was on the front lines of the Iran-Iraq war. And like most of Kurdistan, it was fighting its own war of resistance against Saddam's regime. But Saddam didn't just use chemical weapons there to quell a rebellion. Prosecutors will try to prove that he was implementing a wider plan to extinguish the entire Kurdish race. Saddam's campaign was intricately planned, meticulously documented, and even given a code name. Called Anfal, meaning spoils of war, Saddam targeted Kurds with mass deportations and mass murder. The scale of these crimes is one thing, but proving Saddam's guilt in a court of law is another. So despite impressive, courageous, and driven jurists like Juhi and Abdul-Jabbar, it's easy to doubt a legal system atrophied for decades under Saddam's rule can handle a massive prosecution like this.
But what I'm confident about is that these judges were adequately selected and vetted, that they've been adequately trained. But once the trial starts, anything can happen.
Michael Scharf has personally trained Juhi, Abdul-Jabbar, and others on the Iraqi Special Tribunal who we won't show to protect their identities. Scharf, a law professor at Cleveland's Case Western Reserve University, was recently nominated for the Nobel Prize for his work to bring war criminals to justice in Sierra Leone, the former Yugoslavia, and Rwanda. Those trials took place under the banner of the United Nations. For reasons we'll explain later, the trial of Saddam will not. But that doesn't worry Scharf. He says the Iraqi tribunal meets international legal standards.
The way they've achieved that is by having a statute that's based on the Yugoslavia and Rwanda tribunal statutes, these international statutes that fulfill all the requirements of international law.
One thing Scharf did fear is that the Americans might be pulling all the strings.
I thought that this was basically a kangaroo court controlled by the United States. The more I learned about it, the more I learned that it was actually a very valid and effective tribunal.
The fact that Iraqis really are in charge may be unsettling for many Americans. After all, outside Iraq, nobody has more at stake in this trial than President Bush and his administration.
The United States originally justifying its invasion primarily because of the weapons of mass destruction that were never found. And now justifying the invasion in retrospect by saying that Saddam Hussein was a monster, he was heinous, he was committing the worst crimes known to humankind, and so what we did was good for the world.
So if Saddam looks not like a Hitler or an Idi Amin or Pol Pot, but looks like another two-bit dictator from a bad part of the world, how will that affect our overall objectives in this trial?
Well, in international criminal law, there is a hierarchy of evil with genocide at the very tip of the pyramid. If he's acquitted of the genocide charge, he still could do life in prison, maybe even get the death penalty, but they won't see him as such a monster in history's eyes.
The best chance for a genocide conviction is the Anfal case. That's why American legal advisors were reportedly unhappy that the Iraqis decided not to prosecute that one first. Instead, they'll start with a much lesser-known case, a case involving not thousands but hundreds of lives, and a case in which Saddam will likely argue he did nothing worse than what President Bush did to Al-Qaeda after 9/11. But will that defense fly? That's coming up after the break.
Hello again. I'm Dan Senor, and this is a Fox News investigation. Saddam Hussein on trial. Tonight you've seen the most notorious and horrific crimes alleged against Saddam. Crimes involving chemical weapons, mass graves, hundreds of thousands dead, many of them women and children. In a surprise legal move, however, the Iraqi Special Tribunal has decided to first try Saddam for a far lesser-known case. Our investigation takes us next to Dujil, a town 35 miles north of Baghdad.
In the summer of 1982, Saddam was traveling the country to shore up support for the unpopular Iran-Iraq War, already in its second year. Dujil, a mainly Shiite village, was home to many Iraqis who sided with Iran. July 8, Saddam was making a surprise stop there to talk with tribal leaders. But when he got to this intersection, some in town had another idea. Around 2 o'clock, the presidential motorcade rolled into town. Suddenly, a group of would-be assassins, hiding in palm groves that lined the road, opened fire. Armed with machine guns, the men were nevertheless quickly overpowered. Saddam dove under his car and was unharmed. Qadim al-Jafar's youngest son was one of the plotters.
My son Kareem was killed during the attack in the palm groves. Later the police came and arrested my sons Naji and Sabah. Then they came for the whole family.
And there were other arrests, nearly 1,500 in all. Jamila Hassan told us Iraqi intelligence came and took away her husband and 6 sons.
Saddam took all my sons. I don't know why he took them. By God, they did nothing wrong.
She says she and her 6 daughters were imprisoned for nearly 4 years and tortured repeatedly until their release in 1986.
This is the suffering we've been going through. They beat our knuckles with a stick and they attach electric probes across our arms and chest. How could this go on?
Al-Jafar too was imprisoned and beaten. When he was released 2 years later, he learned that his 3 other sons had also been killed.
They were arrested after the attempted assassination. I still don't know how they died. I've never found their remains.
Saddam will likely say he took appropriate actions against the political enemies who tried to assassinate him and overthrow his government. In all, about 150 villagers were killed in the ambush, in prison, or executed by Saddam's revolutionary court. But law professor Michael Scharf says Saddam's revenge went far beyond that.
What he did, we know, is that he basically demolished the entire town, killed the town people, destroyed all of the date palm groves in the vicinity, and actually salted the ground so nothing would ever grow there again. And if that's not disproportionate, I don't know what is.
The atrocities alleged at Dujil will bring the serious charge of crimes against humanity. But they fall short of the worst charge of all, genocide. Some U.S. advisors are concerned that failing to start with a genocide case is a mistake. But Scharf disagrees.
I actually think it's brilliant.
Scharf says Dujil is the clearest, most manageable of all the possible cases the prosecution could bring. And he says they'll have plenty of evidence to prove one toughest element of the crime alleged, that Saddam was indeed calling the shots.
He was a leader with infinite close control. The insiders who participated in Dajjal and are likely to testify are all going to make this a very strong case.
In fact, those insiders will actually stand trial alongside Saddam. They are Saddam's half-brother, Barzan Ibrahim al-Takriti, former Vice President Taha Yassin Ramadan, Awad Hamad al-Bandar, head of the Revolutionary Court, and 2 local Ba'ath Party officials, Qadim al-Mushaki and his son, Mizher.
I can tell you these defendants have cooperated and have admitted to getting written documents or verbal orders from the Ba'ath regime to commit these crimes.
There's one more advantage to bringing this manageable, clear-cut case first, Scharf says. One that will force prosecutors to focus on and dispose of for good any broad attacks by Saddam on the legitimacy of the tribunal, its judges, or its evidence.
And so if these things get addressed, if these issues get addressed in this trial, then it's much harder for them to raise them by the time we get to some of the strongest cases against him, like the Anfal campaign.
And in fact, I think that's the prosecution strategy here, because then those trials won't be obscured by the broader legal attacks and challenges, and they can focus more on the evidence that's relevant to those cases.
In other words, for Saddam's defense, it all comes down to Dujil. And as you'll see later, his attorney has some surprises in store.
What is your strategy to get Saddam Hussein off?
But next, the first surprise may be the courtroom where it will all take place, a Fox exclusive, right after the break.
So far in this hour, you've heard tales of horror and bravery as Iraq prepares to hold Saddam to account for his crimes. In exclusive interviews, you've met some of the judges and lawyers who've risked their lives to ensure Saddam be brought to justice. And we talked to survivors whose testimony may help seal a case against the former dictator. Now, another Fox News exclusive. A look inside the courtroom itself, at a location so sensitive we could only tell you that it's somewhere in Baghdad's green zone.
For a man who denied his own people the rule of law for so long, just being in this courtroom will be a bit of poetic justice for Saddam.
Above me is a verse from the Quran that reads, "If you must judge, judge wisely." It is fitting that these words overlook this courtroom, where all final decisions about Saddam Hussein will be made.
Under Iraqi civil law, investigative judges, not prosecutors, collect evidence and determine if there's enough to bring charges. As we told you earlier, that probe was the job of this man, Judge Juhi, who defied danger by investigating Saddam's crimes at Dujil. That slaughter of a town will be the first case to be tried by the Iraqi Special Tribunal.
By the time the proceedings reach this chamber, Judge Rod's work will be done. And the fate of Saddam Hussein will be in the hands of a 5-judge panel that will sit right here.
But Saddam will not face a jury of his peers as he would in the U.S. Instead, it will be these trial judges who will hear the evidence and consider arguments from prosecutors and defense attorneys, who will sit on either side of courtroom clerks here. Like any trial, witnesses will be critical to convict or acquit Saddam.
Over here is the witness stand where Saddam and his victims will be eye to eye, some for the first time, in one room. For those witnesses that are understandably concerned about their security, they can have their identities protected by having the curtain closed at the witness stand during their testimony.
But one person who will be exposed to all is Saddam himself.
When Saddam stands trial, he'll be in this part of the courtroom, either in a traditional Iraqi court dock like this, or if security demands something more protective, like a booth enclosed with bulletproof glass.
In fact, after 6 months and $21 million in renovations, this entire building, once a Ba'ath Party office, is a veritable fortress, able to withstand a terror attack from those who don't want to see Saddam in the dock. In a Fox News exclusive interview, General George Casey, the top military commander in Iraq, says an attack is a real possibility.
I think there will be tensions for sure. The grip, the psychological grip that Saddam Hussein still has in the minds of some of the Iraqis is strong.
That's one of the reasons many Iraqis I talked to worry that this trial could backfire.
A number of Iraqi leaders told me they thought this trial was a bad idea. Terrible timing. We've got a major security problem. We've got a real insurgency. We don't need this now.
Right. Iraqi Special Tribunal legal advisor Michael Scharf agrees security is a major factor, but says a trial is critical in helping heal Iraq.
The case on the other side is this. If people are watching on a day-to-day basis the horrors of the Saddam Hussein regime, if they get to hear testimony, if they get to see videos and documentaries, if they get to see the mass graves, ultimately it's going to stabilize the situation. So again, no one really knows how this is going to play out.
And seats will be rare to what promises to be one of the most dramatic trials in history.
Some will actually see it in person in this room here overlooking the courtroom. The Iraqi Special Tribunal will distribute the seats to members of Iraq's government, members of the press, and even some of the victims that suffered in the horrible atrocities over the last 3 decades.
For others, the proceedings will be broadcast live on television and beamed around the world. The intent? To let Iraqis see Saddam for what he truly was. But Scharf advised against that.
I said that was a really bad idea.
A bad idea, Scharf says, because Saddam could use the proceedings to drum up support, and a live international audience could give Saddam, widely described as shrewd, charismatic, and a master of manipulation, the opening he needs to hijack the trial.
But if he has the ability to act as his own counsel, you have no control over that.
He's not speaking to the judges. Saddam is speaking to the world.
And that, I learned, is exactly what his defense team has in mind.
And a political trial should be answered by a political show.
That's coming up after the break.
returning to this Fox News investigation. Saddam Hussein on trial. I'm Dan Senor. Tonight you've met the brave Iraqi jurists who are risking their lives to bring the tyrant to justice. And you've heard the heinous charges they've brought against the former dictator. So what's the defense strategy to get Saddam off? The first problem we had in answering that question was finding out whom to ask.
Saddam's defense team, run by his daughter Ragad in Jordan, claims to have some 2,000 international lawyers, including such well-known figures as former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark and ex-president of Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad. With that many mouthpieces, we figured it would be easy to get someone to talk to us. We tried Ramsey Clark in New York, not known to be camera shy, but he could never find time for us. Ziad Kasaunik, widely reported to head Saddam's defense team, agreed to speak to us in Jordan. We flew over, but he canceled at the last minute. We then got the okay to interview Italian lawyer Giovanni Di Stefano in Rome, who's defended other war criminals like ex-Serb leader Slobodan Milosevic and spoken on behalf of Saddam to just about every news organization. But before we got on the plane, we heard Saddam's daughter fired the whole lot, except one lone representative, Iraqi lawyer Khalil al-Dulaimi. Finally, another Iraqi, Abdul Haq Alani, a key legal advisor to Ragad Hussein, who had just returned from meeting with her, agreed to set the record straight about just who is working on Saddam's defense and what they plan to do at trial. We met him in London.
The defense team. There's been a lot of press reports that it's in disarray.
Not at all. There have been people outside Iraq who claim to represent Saddam Hussein.
But there have been reports that Saddam's daughter actually fired the entire legal team.
Well, this is what I'm saying. It's a misconception. She said that anybody outside Iraq who claims to represent the president does not have the authority to do so. That's all what she said.
In fact, Alani says Saddam's lawyers have been developing a powerful legal line of attack.
What is your strategy to get Saddam Hussein off?
First and foremost, for the Americans to accept the international judgment that this war was unlawful.
So you believe that the war against Iraq, against Saddam Hussein, was illegal?
Yes, it's an invasion. Of course it's illegal.
And therefore, Alani says, everything that followed has no legal authority either. Not the elections, not the new government, and not the court trying Saddam, the man he considers to be the country's true president.
Do you believe that he is still legally and technically the president of Iraq?
Absolutely. We can't choose and select as we please. When it pleases us, we consider that to be a democracy. When it doesn't please us, we call it dictatorship.
And as president, the defense claims that the Saddam-era Constitution provides him full immunity from prosecution and powers to take whatever measures necessary to protect the nation's security. Michael Scharf, who's advised tribunals in Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and the former Yugoslavia, says he's been involved in enough war crimes trials to know that strategy won't fly.
But Saddam Hussein may say, I was thrown from power illegally. There was illegal regime change.
Yeah, well, the UN has not concurred that it was illegal. And in fact, the Security Council has also passed a resolution saying that the new government has to establish accountability for the crimes that occurred during Saddam Hussein's regime, which is an implied endorsement of the Iraqi Special Tribunal process.
If you are not able to prove that the tribunal is illegal and the trial proceeds, then what's left of the legal strategy?
Well, I think this is not really a legal question. It's a political question. That happened to Nelson Mandela.
Are you comparing Nelson Mandela to Saddam Hussein?
Yeah, why wouldn't I? Each one of them is a leader of his own country. Everybody was saying that Nelson Mandela was a terrorist, and he was justly imprisoned.
But this isn't a strategy to defend Saddam Hussein.
But then his trial is not legal. His trial is political, and a political trial should be answered by a political show.
That's why Alani says he's advising Saddam to boycott the proceedings altogether. Scharf doubts that will happen.
Most people don't realize that he himself is a lawyer.
Scharf believes Saddam wants to represent himself to really try to turn the televised tribunal into a spectacle.
One of the things I've heard about Saddam Hussein is that he was obsessed with following the trial of Slobodan Milosevic.
I consider this tribunal a false tribunal.
And I think he was very impressed with what Slobodan Milosevic was doing and will try to accomplish the same things. Slobodan Milosevic was not trying to get an acquittal of the charges. He was trying to resurrect his place in history.
The question is, Scharf says, whether the Iraqi judges will let Saddam grandstand and make speeches, as the former Yugoslavian leader has done at his trial at The Hague, turning that trial into what many feel is a farce that has already stretched on for nearly 4 years. The Iraqi government recently adopted new rules, making it harder for Saddam to defend himself. But his lawyers say Saddam should have that right. Whether or not Saddam represents himself, one thing's for sure. He or his lawyers will try their level best to embarrass U.S. leaders.
And he's going to try to use the Bush and Rumsfeld doctrine of what they've been doing in Afghanistan and Iraq to show that it's perfectly legitimate for him to do so when he's attacked.
Would Saddam putting down an uprising or punishing a town for the existence of residents who may have tried to kill him, would that be appropriate punishment by Saddam?
As a matter of principle, any government in the world is entitled to defend itself from insurrection. We know that.
And he'll try to call some very high-profile witnesses.
I would summon the President of the United States as a witness, absolutely.
What about the President's predecessor, Bill Clinton?
Absolutely. And Rumsfeld himself in 1984 sold chemical weapons to Iraq. He has to answer to that charge too.
What about George Bush Sr.?
Every one of them. Everyone who took part from 1991 until 2003 would have to come and testify under oath.
And of course, you've got the famous Rumsfeld handshake, where it looked like the United States was bankrolling the war against Iran with knowledge that Saddam Hussein was committing atrocities that we're now trying to prosecute him for.
Do you think President Bush will agree to testify if he's asked, called on to testify?
I think it's going to be a very difficult question for the Bush administration. The tribunal and the U.S. government knows that if these people don't testify, it's going to make it look like Saddam Hussein's not getting a fair trial.
White House officials I spoke to said no plans are being made for any U.S. leader to testify. If President Bush were to appear, Scharf says, he'd likely do so via video link.
The real risks to him are what will it make him look like in the Arab world and the international world if he is questioned by Saddam Hussein or his lawyers.
But is there a possibility of even something worse?
Is there a scenario where if this ends, Saddam gets off and America's humiliated?
I have seen the evidence against Saddam and the many trials that are going to be prosecuted, and I cannot conceive of any situation where he'll be acquitted of all of the charges.
Then Abdul Haq Alani stunned us with his prediction.
Is there any scenario under which Saddam gets off?
Yes. A political settlement between the United States and Saddam Hussein, because they can't suffer the 100 casualties a day they're giving. They can't suffer that indefinitely. And it's going to go on and on and on, and it's going to intensify.
He thinks Saddam will get a plea bargain.
So you think that the United States will ignore the freely elected government of Iraq, reach out to Saddam Hussein, ignore this trial, ignore the charges against him, and put him back in power?
Yes, it may sound fanciful, but it's very, very plausible and very likely. Yes, I would say that is exactly what would happen. And it would not be very difficult to sell it to the public in the United States.
Coming up next, should Saddam, if found guilty, be executed?
What were we going to do? We're not going to tell them, no, you can't. It's their country.
Welcome back to our special investigation. Saddam Hussein on trial. I'm Dan Senor. Tonight, in a series of Fox News exclusives, we've taken you inside Iraq and showed you how that infant democracy is preparing to confront its bloody past. But what does the trial of Saddam Hussein mean for the world and for Americans? This is a big difference from Baghdad.
Yeah, it sure is.
No Humvees, no gunshots putting you to sleep.
Nobody shooting at me.
Though my old boss now lives a million miles away from the war zone, Iraq is never far from Paul Brimmer's mind. He's now writing a book about his extraordinary and historic 14 months as administrator of Iraq. So he's been spending a lot of time thinking about the lessons of America's war to end the 30-year reign of Saddam Hussein. Brimmer doesn't talk to the press much these days, but He agreed to meet me, a former aide, at his home in a sleepy New England town.
You know, what's happening in Iraq is a very fundamental change of an ancient society, moving from a tyranny to some form of representative government. One has to put the trial in the broad context of reestablishing the rule of law in Iraq. It's fundamental, I think, in a representative government, which is, again, one of the objectives we and the Iraqis have, that the rule of law, not the rule of one man, be clear. And every one of these steps along the way, the capture of Saddam, the handover of sovereignty, the elections, the writing of the Constitution, is a step along what is going to be a long-term path to, I believe, a stable and peaceful Iraq.
Some people I've talked to are worried that the Iraqis could botch this trial and will be sorry we even started it to begin with.
Look, in any criminal trial, there's always a risk. Yeah, you could argue there will be maybe some short-term problems in doing it. But again, this is the Iraqis' decision. This isn't something the Americans decided. This is something the Iraqis decided.
That is something that Brimmer is emphatic about, that the Iraqis are in charge. The best evidence that Americans aren't pulling the strings will be seen in the punishment phase, where, if convicted, Saddam will face death. The Iraqis had the death penalty for thousands of years, but many around the world assumed that the new Iraq would bow to international pressure and set aside the death penalty for Saddam in favor of life imprisonment.
I remember when I was having a press conference and all the reporters were saying, well, there are critics in the international community who won't participate because it's a death penalty. How could you impose a death penalty?
They wanted to be able to impose the death penalty for various crimes, including crimes against humanity and genocide, and they did. And what were we going to do? We're not going to tell them, no, you can't. It's their country.
Partly because of the death penalty, the United Nations refused to help with the trial. But one thing the Iraqis apparently wanted more than the UN was the certitude that Saddam, once found guilty, would never come back to punish them.
I had an Iraqi politician tell me after the capture of Saddam that her brother had been taken away from the university. Back in 1980, he had said something offhand, moderately critical of Saddam. He'd been taken away by the intelligence services and killed. And she had never told her children about this, even after liberation, out of fear that Saddam somehow would come back. It was only when Saddam was captured and actually there that she had the courage to tell her children that their uncle had been assassinated by Saddam. The trial is an important part of facing up to the past and getting past it. And that's how I think we need to see it.
My sense is the things we're doing in Iraq, specifically the trial, is part of the war on terrorism, is part of combating these awful ideologies. It's about turning that part of the world upside down for the better, so these dictators can't torment and torture and murder their citizens, and they can't harbor these terrorists.
I think it's always been related to the war on terrorism. I don't think there's any question. Saddam, after all, was considered a supporter of terrorism, according to the U.S. government. The same is true of the current government in Syria and the government in Iran. So you've got two neighbors who are also state sponsors of terrorism. That one of these tyrants can be brought to justice is a very important message.
You often talk about your hope for Iraq. Yeah. What will Iraq look like in 10 years, 20 years? How does this trial process fit into achieving that?
It's saying that that era, when Iraq was under one of the most brutal tyrants of the 20th century, that era is over. We never thought it was going to be a straight line. It was always going to have ups and downs. I think the Iraqi people want, essentially, to live in peace. They want to have a representative government, Iraqi democracy. Those are the things that we want to have. And I think they'll get there.
As the Arab world's first war crimes tribunal is set to take place, millions in Iraq and around the world will be watching this dramatic event. And the fate of the Middle East may just turn on the outcome. Tune into Fox News and log on to foxnews.com for the most complete coverage anywhere of this historic trial. For now, I'm Dan Senor. Thanks for watching. Good night.